Welcome to this program that's going to celebrate the life and work of Richard Wilbur. The five people here on the stage all knew him very well in somewhat different capacities. I am David Sofield. My claim to attention here is primarily that Dick and I taught together at Amherst when he came back to the college at age 87 to take up the Simpson lectureship, which Robert Frost, a great friend of his earlier, had held. And he said he would only do it if I would teach with him, so of course I did. And we did it for 7 years and had a good time doing it. And probably a couple of people who were in the class, a couple of former students who here, I'm not sure, but I'm not asking you to raise your hands. Yes, thank you. At least two right there. Anyway, it was terrific time. We stopped so we did it from 2008 to 2014. Dick said that's probably enough. He was in his 90s at that point. I too was getting older fast, so we stopped. And then he had a couple of more years of life in Cummington, Massachusetts, where he and Charlie lived and with their kids until they moved away. So that's about all you need from me at this point. We're going to speak, each of us individually, about our friendships with Dick in the second part of this program. So the program is in two parts, the works and the life. So we're going to talk first about poems, and we've each chosen poems that we've had copied and are at the back, and I hope all of you have them. If you don't, look on with somebody who does, because that part of the program, and it'll be most of it, will be, as it were, a class. I don't know how to do anything but a class, so you're going to have to bear with some close reading. Dick once said, and he's quoted in the wonderful biography that Mary Bagg and Bob Bagg wrote and published not long ago, as saying, what do you do in class besides close read? Well, Bill Pritchard does some other things, and you'll hear about that, and superbly. I've also taught with him. So we are Ralph Hammann on the end. Ralph Hammann came into Dick's life later than he came into the lives of the rest of us here. But he came into Ralph's life and Ralph into his in a interesting and sustained and close way. Ralph proposed to Dick that he film Dick and compile what is now, I've looked at every minute of it, a 9-hour and 20-minute, got it, documentary of Dick's life and career. A good bit of those hours of footage are taken up with Dick's reading poems, some of the poems more than once in a public setting at the Hillstead Museum in Farmington, Connecticut, but mostly in the house in Cummington, where Ralph and Dick developed a close, sustained relationship that meant a lot to both of them. Bob and Mary Bagg, in my immediate right, are the biographers. Bob and I are in the class of 1957. He here, I not here, but not all that far away and not so different, Princeton. And he's known Dick for a long while, and he recounts this in the biography once. I hope I'm not taking away from his saying it here, but if I am, I apologize. Questioned Dick in class when Bob was a junior or senior at Amherst about what Randall Jarrell or Horace Gregory or both of them, was some confusion. Bob has straightened it out in the book. So a criticism of Dick's poetry at that period in Dick's career, which was just after the third book was published, or maybe right around the time, Things of This World in 1956, and it's a good story. So get the book for lots of reasons. It's a very, very good book. Charlie Wilbur, Dick's wonderful, wonderful, beloved wife, asked Bob and Mary if they would write a biography of Dick, and they happily accepted and worked on it for years and years. Before Charlie died, they have hours of interviews with her, so she is represented in the book in the fullness of her, I guess I want to say, goodness. She was certainly good to me and to my wife Lisa, who's here. And they will say more about their friendship with Dick, and I'll say more. Bill Pritchard, on my left, has been at Amherst College, what, 6? Oh, I forgot. I'm going to say something like 60 years on the faculty, before which he was a student at the college, a wonderful student of philosophy, writing his senior thesis on William James, and he took him a while, as it took me a while, to come around to graduate school in literature, which he did at Harvard and I at Stanford. But he's known Dick for a long, long time and has reviewed him book by book by book as the individual thin volumes of poetry came out. And I'm not sure if there's anybody else who's probably reviewed Dick's poetry as it came out as much as, and there are a couple of very substantial essays on Dick's work by Bill. Bill is my beloved colleague in the department. I've just retired after 53 years in the department, and Bill, although he's emeritus, is still teaching 2 courses a year, and he's even older than I am, so more power to him. So, and we're going to divide the talk about Dick's poetry into early, middle, and late. These are rough categorizations, but I think it'll work out. And we're going to talk about poems. So you have the poems in your lap, and before we start doing that, Ralph is going to show, 10 minutes of footage of Dick as a teacher at Amherst, talking with students, and Ralph talking with students about the classes they were in of Dick's and mine, creative writing and literature classes as they were. The ones that you're going to hear from are from the creative writing, poetry writing class that we did. So I'm going to turn it over to Ralph at this point. He'll say a word and then show you 10 minutes of film, and then the Baggs, and then Bill, and then me. And then the second part of the program is really about our friendships with Dick individually and Charlie. So Ralph.
Okay, can you hear me? I can't get any closer to the mic with the computer here. I think that the most satisfying words I heard in the last 5 years were, "I approve," and those were Dick's hearty comments on each section of the film that we began a collaboration on in 2012. When we first sat down to talk about it, Dick said, well, I'll read a few poems and I'll answer a few questions. And I said, yeah, we'll do about an hour's worth. And 5 years later, right up until 2017, we were still talking, partly because Dick is, of course, a genius, and also because he's such a charming presence. You just wanted to hear more and more, and who was I to edit the words of Dick Wilbur? Plus, owing to the esteem that he's held in by many people, a number of other people came on board and wanted to offer their words of tribute or appreciation to Dick. 3 of the people, David and Mary and Bob, Stephen Sondheim, Dana Gioia, Donald Hall, Alicia Stallings, John Simon even. And so the film grew to, as David said, about 9 hours and 20 minutes. But above all, what's important in the film is Dick's constant, continual presence. And what I think we have here in these 5 DVDs, which are not yet released, but this is a prototype, and you have, if you picked up one of these, you have information on how to contact me to find out when things happen. But what we have here, I really firmly believe, is a master class in poetry, in the creative process, and perhaps above all, in how to conduct one's life with grace, and as it says on the back of this, humanity, particularly in one's later years. So, the clip that I'm going to show you, it's a series of little clips. First, a bit from the introduction with Dick reading one of his poems that I think tells you a great deal about him. Then a clip from his early days at Amherst, then his days with David here as a teacher, and finally him reading one of his favorite poems. So See if this works. You can dim the lights and we'll begin.
Poetry came out of song, didn't it? And a poem had, whatever it's saying, must have something in it that's worth singing about. Ecclesiastes 11:1. We must cast our bread upon the waters, as the ancient preacher said, trusting that it may amply be restored to us after many a day. That old metaphor, drawn from rice farming on the river's flooded shore, helps us to believe that it's no great sin to give, hoping to receive. Therefore I shall throw broken bread this sullen day out across the snow, betting crust and crumb that birds will gather, and that one more spring will come.
He tells stories to me, about Amherst College mostly. These days, we have lunch after the class, sometimes with these very kids, all of whom have had lunch with Dick Wilbur. But if you say the word Chi Psi to Dick Wilbur, which is the fraternity that he was in when he was a student at Amherst from 1938 to 1942, he's off and running.
This would have been in my freshman year at Amherst when I became a member of Chi Psi fraternity, and this is my fellow freshmen of that year, fellow joiners of Chi Psi. I think we did one straight up and straight-faced picture for the purposes of the yearbook, I suppose, and then this jollier picture was contrived.
Yes. Well, and this is you?
Yes. I'm trying to look thoughtful there.
Rodin's thinker.
Yes. Yeah, that's Laureate. This is Frank Stockbridge, one of my best friends at Amherst and a member of Chi Psi and the presiding officer of the fraternity. The Johnson Chapel is behind us.
This is Johnson Chapel.
Yeah, and so this would be North
That's where
Dormitory.
that's where you resided.
Yes,
Your room was on the top floor?
top floor.
Okay.
Top
And
floor and rather near the bell tower. This looks like the back view of Chi Psi fraternity. If you drive from here to Amherst, just before you reach the stoplight in Amherst, Chi Psi fraternity is an edifice on the left with many pillars and a nice porch suitable for ping pong. And there's the obligatory cigarette of those days.
you're 21.
Uh-huh.
This was before you were publishing, huh?
That's right. Except in the Amherst publications.
Right.
At the moment, by the kind request of Amherst College, I'm teaching over there 1 day a week. I go over and to Amherst, driven by a kind student, and teach a class, co-teach a class with my old friend David Sofield. David and I were partners in tennis for a long time. That is to say, we played on the same side, and we were pretty rough on our enemies when we could. He's an awfully good tennis player and still is. And he's a very good teacher. And so if my slowly increasing deafness or my dumbness makes it hard for me to respond to a student question, David can handle it, both with scholarly brilliance and with kindness toward me. To give a student in sophomore year or junior year an excuse for diverting his attention from the papers he must write and the books he must read to trying a few poems is a very good way to keep something alive in someone who might be promising to be a poet in time. And if that doesn't happen, sometimes it happens that the collective criticism of the class produces some good beginning critics.
He's just been a constant source of inspiration for me, and I think it was most moving for me to have him as a professor for the Writing Poetry 1 workshop, and I have kept all the poems that he's written, his little notes to me on, and all of his comments I constantly look back to, and I find are just really inspiring to me. And I think that just the way that he can point out little moments that are worth keeping, to me, gives me hope. And I really appreciate it. Oh, thank you. I really appreciate the time that he takes to really pay attention to student poems. And I think that anyone who gets the opportunity to have that experience is just infinitely lucky.
Well, mere exposure to poems and trying to write poems of one's own are excellent exercises for the heart and the mind. So not all courses should be courses in other people. It's become truer that too many people regard a college education as preparation for the job market. And what we do in writing courses is a preparation for having a live heart and a live mind in spite of the job market. My daughter is by now an established writer. She's published short stories in many a magazine. But this poem looks in at her as she was in her junior high school days. She would hurry home from school and up to her second floor bedroom, and pretty soon there would be the sound of her typewriter tapping, and she'd have a story underway. This is called The Writer. In her room at the prow of the house, where light breaks and the windows are tossed with linden, my daughter is writing a story. I pause in the stairwell, hearing from her shut door a commotion of typewriter keys like a chain hauled over a gunwale. Young as she is, the stuff of her life is a great cargo, and some of it heavy. I wish her a lucky passage. But now it is she who pauses, as if to reject my thought and its easy figure. A stillness greatens in which the whole house seems to be thinking. And then she is at it again with a bunched clamor of strokes, and again is silent. I remember the dazed Starling, which was trapped in that very room 2 years ago. How we stole in, lifted a sash and retreated, not to affright it. And how for a helpless hour through the crack of the door we watched the sleek, wild, dark, and iridescent creature batter against the brilliance, drop like a glove to the hard floor or the desktop, and wait then, humped and bloody, for the wits to try it again. And how our spirits rose when suddenly sure it lifted off from a chair back, beating a smooth course for the right window and clearing the sill of the world. It is always a matter, my darling, of life or death, as I had forgotten. I wish what I wished you before, but harder.
Beautiful.
You need a little more light.
Light, please. Am I going to go? Okay.
The bags.
When you saw that picture of North Dorm, I had a frisson. I had the same room that Dick Wilbur had when I was a sophomore. While at Amherst, Dick only wrote light verse, and here is a 3-line sample published in The Student. What makes me bite my nails are girls who wear Angora when I'm wearing tails. Wilbur began his term as chairman of the Amherst Student in 1941, halfway through his junior year. He published several editorials opposing our entry into the European War. He what he didn't care for was the British Empire. But on December 8th, the day after Pearl Harbor, his editorial titled, "Now That We Are in It," was published on the front page of The Student. But it ended by looking ahead to a post-war era in which America and its allies have made the world, quote, less combustible, and let's hope it stays that way. He also predicted to his mentors, Armour Craig and Theodore Baird, that unlike the First World War's poets, the poets of the new war would not denounce politicians and generals, but write about the one and the many, that is, individuals and populations impacted by the fighting. And so he did in all of his own 10 war poems. His early war poems were unrhymed free verse, mostly about civilians affected by the fighting and the suffering and deprivation it caused. What inspired him to write formal rhymed verse was the death of his fellow Signal Corps member, Corporal Lloyd Tywater, a Jeep driver who drove into the range of a German machine gun nest and was killed along with the intelligence officer he was driving. This poem gains power and historic resonance by distancing Tywater's death from poetic celebration. And I'll read Tywater. Death of Sir Nihil, book the nth, upon the charred and clotted sward, lacking the lily of our Lord, a lasses of the hyacinth, could flicker from behind his ear a whistling silver throwing knife, and with a holler punch the life out of a swallow in the air. Behind the Laureate's butterfly shuttled his white and gritted grin, and cuts of sky would roll within the noose hole when he spun it high. The violent, neat, and practiced skill was all he loved and all he learned. When he was hit, his body turned to clumsy dirt before he fell. And what to say of him, God knows. Such violence and such repose. And I'll conclude with one more poem called First Snow in Alsace. The snow came down last night like moths, burned on the moon. It fell till dawn, covered the town with simple cloths. Absolute snow lies rumpled on what shellbursts scattered and deranged, entangled railings, creviced lawn. As if it did not know they'd changed, snow smoothly clasps the roofs of homes, fear-gutted, trustless, and estranged. The ration stacks are milky domes. Across the ammunition pile, the snow has climbed in sparkling combs. You think, beyond the town a mile or two, this snowfall fills the eyes of soldiers dead a little while. Persons and persons in disguise, walking the new air white and fine, trade glances quick with shared surprise. At children's windows, heaped, benign, as always, winter shines the most, and frost makes marvelous designs. The night guard, coming from his post, 10 first snows back in thought, walks slow and warms him with a boyish boast. He was the first to see the snow. Thank you. Mary.
Of the many things that Amherst brought to Dick, of course, one of the most important was the opportunity to meet Charlie. Her name was Mary Charlotte Hayes Ward, but she was known from the start as Charlie. She was a Smith student, an editor of its poetry magazine, and a young woman who from an early age had a very specific romantic daydream about the type of man she would marry. He would be a poet named Richard, as in Coeur de Lion, she told us. And an Amherst man, like her grandfather and father. A blind date arranged by mutual friends brought Charlie and Dick together. Minutes after they headed into town toward a college beer hall called the Draper Hotel, she reached for Dick's hand, convinced their bond was immediate and unbreakable. He was her racehorse, she said, destined for something big. Now, we were a bit skeptical about how neatly her daydream seemed to dovetail with reality. And even Dick admitted that at times Charlie's imagination ran wild. But not long before our book went into production, I found a copy of a handwritten letter from Dick to Charlie that I was sure I'd never seen before. It had slipped from a folder of wartime letters to the floor of the file cabinet. It turned out to be a real find, Dick's version of Charlie's love at first sight story. Here's the relevant part of it, written just days after their first date. Incidentally, Dick wrote, I have just one brother, a small muscular clown who is coming up to this other Eden next year, and I'm majoring in English. It is horribly true that we know next to nothing about each other. I'm not going to pull any of this seemed as if I had always known you crap, but perhaps the good Lord construed us so fearfully alike that you seemed somewhat familiar from the first. Have you any sisters? Mother writes me, I wrote to her about you, to say, don't make her walk too fast or too far. A girl can't keep up with those long legs of yours. She'd be a good sport about it, but she won't love you if you give her cramps. You really must cherish her. He signed the letter, See you, babe. Dick and Charlie cherished each other for 65 years, marrying in June 1942, right after Wilbur's graduation and just before he enlisted in the Army Signal Corps. I'm going to read June Light from The Beautiful Changes. The poem is a meditation on innocent love, with pairs providing the Edenic illusions in a metaphoric progression that culminates in the third stanza. Dick wrote the poem to Charlie in that month from France and sent it to her for their second anniversary. Actually, that last part is my romantic fantasy. When I asked Dick if that had been the case, he said he didn't recall, but he agreed it would have been a good idea to do so. June Light. Your voice, with clear location of June days, called me outside the window. You were there, light yet composed, as in the just, soft stare of uncontested summer, all things raise plainly their seeming into seamless air. That you have looked as simple and entire as that picked pear you tossed me, and your face as legible as pear skin's fleck and trace, which promises always wine by mottled fire more fatal flesh than ever human grace. Your gay gift, oh, when I saw it fall into my hands, through all that native light, it seemed as blessed with truth and new delight as must have been the first great gift of all. I think the first time I read this poem, which was rather late in my reading of Dick. I was so moved by the wordplay of location and locution in the first line that he actually put himself right there in June talking about what he was articulating. When the Boston Globe published Charlie's obituary in 2007, the headline writers tagged her name with the phrase, "inspired and guided poets." The Berkshire Eagle's notice of her memorial service called her a friend and supporter to many writers, including Ralph Ellison, Stanley Kunitz, Theodore Roethke, John Malcolm Brennan, and James Merrill. No doubt the list omitted a larger number of names. As David Sofield said so eloquently at her memorial service, "Thank God she cared for the amateurs among us. Every writer I've known has been profoundly envious of Dick's conjugal good fortune." Wilbur himself acknowledged Charlie's remarkable ability for figuring out what worked and what didn't in a poem. "As I went on writing poems, without deliberately trying to do so," he said, "I began to write with her taste and sensibilities, as well as my own. I suppose the muse is thought to be a participator, but she was an unusually participating muse." Charlie would have agreed. She told us in 2006, "Dick is, as I said many times, a perfectionist, someone who is stoic, who is very much a controller, in a good sense, sometimes in not such a good sense for him. Someone who never wants to ask for help. He used to say when we moved to Portland and his life had gotten very complex by then, 'Charlie, do everything, do everything.' And this became a family joke. Well, he meant by that, take care of everything around the bones of my life, because my professional life is just about eating me up. So I did. I took care of everything." Charlie appeared in or inspired 10 of her husband's poems. Taken together, they form a many-faceted portrait of both her and their marriage. Some draw on elements universal to all lovers. Others include unmistakable biographical detail from their lives together. And in others, Wilbur addresses her directly. Fans of the late Aubade, for instance, will notice that pairs appear in this poem about how a mature couple spent a particularly idyllic morning. And one of my favorite lines from that poem is, "Bring us up some chilled white wine and some blue cheese and crackers and some fine ruddy-skinned pears."
Thank you. Wonderful.
Bill?
I think I can do it from here, maybe. I always stand up to teach. Can you hear me? Philip Roth is on my mind because he's dead. And if Wilbur, as he probably is, had the best year of any late 20th century poet, thanks a lot. Philip Roth had the best year of any late 20th century novelist. That's the only thing they share in common. Much attention has been lavished on the formal beauties of Richard Wilbur's poetry, his command of line and stanza, his metaphorical ingenuity, his nimble movement between one tone and another, all combined to make up a lifetime of the figures that poems make. Increasingly over the years, his voice took on authority and gravity as he spoke about ultimate matters, sometimes from deep within, about life, love, death, transience. I'm thinking of a very early poem like The Beautiful Changes, or much later ones like This Pleasing, Anxious Being, or The Reader. But any quality, if any quality, has been overlooked or not given quite the attention it deserves, it's what I call very loosely Wilbur's humor. Another complicated notion, his wit. T.S. Eliot, writing about Andrew Marvell, after making a list of all the things wit was not, called it a tough reasonableness beneath a slight lyric grace. That does for Dick, except his lyric grace was not slight. In these brief remarks about 3 poems, very brief, I'm going to neglect, perforce, a whole aspect of Wilbur's work, his wonderful books for children and adults, like Opposites and The Disappearing Alphabet. They deserve to have a whole essay devoted to their brilliance. In thinking about what first drew me to his poetry when I began to read it, yes, about 65 years ago, a short poem from his second book, Ceremony, comes to mind, and I've printed that up for you. Museum piece. The good gray guardians of art patrol the halls on spongy shoes, impartially protective, though perhaps suspicious of Toulouse. Here dozes one against the wall, disposed upon a funeral chair. A Degas dancer pirouettes upon the parting of his hair. See how she spins. The grace is there, but strain as well is plain to see. Degas loved the two together, beauty joined to energy. Edgar Degas purchased once a fine El Greco, which he kept against the wall beside his bed to hang his pants on while he slept. This is what Robert Frost liked in a poem, what he called dry humor with all the wet squeezed out of it. The final stanza of Museum Piece, for example, should be said without any tonal nudgings this way or that, as it makes a serious joke about the true artist's obliviousness to what other people buy paintings for. Edgar Degas purchased once a fine El Greco, which he kept against the wall beside his bed to hang his pants on while he slept. Sometimes you think you know a poet's work very well and then come across something that you missed completely, as I did 5 days ago. And such was my experience with a small poem in 5 stanzas, rhyming A-B, to his skeleton. Why will you vex me with these bone spurs in the ear, with X-rayed phlebolith and calculus? See here, noblest of armatures, the grin which bears my teeth is mine as yet, not yours. Did you not stand beneath this flesh? I could not stand, but would revert to slime, informous and unmanned. And I may come in time to which your peace my fate, your sculpture my renown. Still, I have held you straight and mean to lay you down without too much disgrace when what can perish dies. For now then, keep your place and do not colonize. The central part of the wit, well, is he the first poet ever to have addressed a poem to his skeleton? I don't know. A central part of the wit is how the sentences run over the line, stop where you don't quite expect them to, make you pay pleasurable attention to matters of syntax. The meter is trimeter, 3 beats to the line, sense units played against end rhymes to make a sort of tripping rhythm. This is how it's proper to speak to one's skeleton, if one decides to do so, with just a bit of warning and potential reproof. For now then, keep your place and do not colonize. Final example of complicated wit, one of my very favorite poems, which nobody loves as much as I do, except Wilbur himself. Also in trimeter with a title that immediately suggests what it's going to be about and not about. Piccolo Commedia distinguishes its range from the large one Dante took charge of. 13 stanzas, A-B-B-A, but also a tricky thing he sometimes does to the full rhyme. He is no one I really know, the sun-charred, gaunt young man by the highway's edge in Kansas 30-odd years ago. On a tourist cabin veranda, 2 middle-aged women sat. One, in a white dress, fat, with a rattling glass in her hand, called, "Son, don't you find the heat? Don't you feel the heat? Get up here into the shade." Like a good boy, I obeyed and was given a crate for a seat and an orange crush and gin. "This state," she said, "is hell." Her thin friend cackled, "Well, dear, you've got to fight sin with sin." No harm in a drink, my stars, said the fat one, jerking her head. And I'll take no lip from Ed, him with his damn cigars. Laughter. A combine whined on past, and dry grass bent in the backwash. Liquor went like an ice pick into my mind. Beneath her skirt, I spied 2 sea cows on a floe. Go talk to Mary Jo, son. She's reading a book inside. As I gangled in at the door, a pink girl curled in a chair, looked up with an ingenue stare. Screenland lay on the floor. Amazed by her starlet's pout and the way her eyebrows arched, I felt both drowned and parched. Desire leapt up like a trout. Hello, she said, and her gum gave a calculating crack. At once, from the lightless back of the room, there came the grumble of someone heaving from bed, a Zippo's click and flare, then, more and more apparent, the shuffling form of Ed, who neither looked nor spoke, but moved in profile by, blinking one gelid eye in his elected smoke. This is something I've never told, and some of it I forget. But the heat, I can feel it yet, and that conniving cold. In this little comedy, the young man has a glimpse of hell, but lived to tell the tale. It's a hell presided over by the shuffling form of Ed. Combined, the 3 stanzas, the 3 stanzas that precede the ending go like this, and in them, there are a couple of rhyme lines that don't rhyme, or they have an extra syllable. Hello, she said, and her gum gave a calculated crack. At once, from the lightless back of the room, there came the grumble. Well, grumble doesn't rhyme with gum, but yeah, grum does. Of someone heaving from bed, a Zippo's click and flare, then more and more apparent. Apparent doesn't rhyme with, but a pair flare, the shuffling form of Ed. Now, nobody's going to hear that, probably. I didn't hear it till I noticed it recently. It's just part of the workmanship. He couldn't help it if he tried making something as good as that. So Ed especially presiding over this darkish commedia, but with an inferno, purgatorio, or surely paradiso not in sight. It's instead a neat example of Wilbur's human comedy. Thanks.
From that not quite love poem, to be sure, I'm going to talk about 3 love poems. And 2 of them come from late in his career. The poem For C standing, of course, for Charlie, his wife, from Mayflies in the year 2000, and then The House, which is one of the last poems he wrote. I'm sure, not the very last, because he gave me a copy of what I think is the very last, gave my wife and me a copy and signed it, but a poem from Anterooms, his last book in 2010. But I want to go back to a poem that he published much earlier. So this is on 3 love poems, early and then 2 later ones. And you can, or at least it is my contention, that one can appreciate, if that's the right word, and it may be, the later ones in relation to the earlier one, which, as Bill said about some of the poetry that he was writing back when, that is before, in the, I guess, 3rd quarter, one would say, of the 20th century, he was the master technician of verse in the English language. This is undisputed. He was criticized for it, that is to say, for the technical dexterity and skill being so great that it somehow got in the way of a more direct expression of feeling. I never thought that was quite right, but those critics were writing at a time, and many of them were excellent poets themselves, when it was the fashion to talk pretty straightforwardly about hard things in your life and in the life of your partner, if you had a partner. I would put the context for these 3 poems back who wrote great love poems, right, in the 20th century in the English language? Robert Frost, The Silken Tent. W.H. Auden's great poem, Lay Your Sleeping Head, My Love, Human on My Faithless Arm. Elizabeth Bishop's The Shampoo, a somewhat under-recognized poem, but Bishop was a great master. And then One Art. It's a bit of a strain to call One Art a love poem, but not when you finish the poem. It's about the desperation of worrying that you're losing the person you really, really love. It was written late in Bishop's career. Bishop, all of these poets were friends of Dick Wilbur. He was superbly connected to the other poets in his time, as Bob and Mary have indicated too. And then Robert Lowell's poem, The Dolphin. Lowell and Wilbur were often juxtaposed as somebody who did things exactly by the book, right, and therefore was the duller for Lowell's being able to go beyond formal regularity, if I suppose you could use that word. He practiced a lot of that early in his career, Lowell did, but in 1959 in the book Life Studies, he broke out of that and got very, very famous, if you will. Was thought to be the leader of the poets of his generation. Time has not treated Lowell quite as generously as it might have, but it's all right with me because it has meant the elevation of Elizabeth Bishop, his great friend, to be sure, and I would say superior, and to an extent Wilbur, whose time it'll take more decades, as people at this table are saying, for Wilbur to be fully appreciated. So here's the early one from 1950, A Simile for Her Smile, a clever title. It's a word within a word almost. Wilbur has a whole book for children on words within words, some of which are supremely clever. Most of them are supremely clever, but smile is the word simile without the I, so the I comes out, and so a smile for a smile. The poem is a kind of smiling. Here's how it goes, and you've got copies. Your smiling, or the hope, the thought of it, makes in my mind such pause and abrupt ease as when the highway bridge gates fall, balking the hasty traffic, which must sit on each side massed and staring, while deliberately the drawbridge starts to rise. Then horns are hushed, the oil smoke rarefies. Above the idling motors, one can tell the packet's smooth approach. The slip of the silken river past the sides, the ringing of clear bells, the dip and slow cascading of the paddle wheel. It's extremely dexterous, this poem. It's in pentameters until you realize that two of the lines in the same position in the second stanza as in the first are not pentameters, 5-stress lines, but tetrameters, 4-stress lines. The rhyme scheme is ABC, ACB in both stanzas. Wilbur would not have done anything other than that ever. In fact, once he's got the stanza form established, in the first stanza, he always repeats it. Can play with it a little, but not very much. The interesting thing to note here, and it took me forever to notice it, is that the tetrameter lines, which are the C rhymes, the third and fifth lines of each stanza, fall while, slip, dip, right? The packet smooth approach, the slip, so 8 syllables, 4 stresses, the ringing of clear bells, the dip, and so on, are so subtly embedded in the poem that you don't realize until you look hard at it. Maybe read it aloud a few times, which I strongly recommend, and even type it out yourself or handwriting. If you handwrite it out, you can learn a lot by doing that, as I tire my students by telling them in class after class. But I don't want to obscure or to ignore what the poem is actually saying in this very, very elegant form. Your smiling, or the hope, the thought of it, makes in my mind, this is a very, very typical Wilburian metrical gesture, beginning lines in poems that are predominantly iambic, in other words, unstressed syllable, followed by stressed syllable, and carrying that through the line and the subsequent lines and the stanzas. But he likes to vary that, and he's got two ways of varying it that occur in almost every poem that is in iambic measure, and almost every poem Wilbur wrote until he started taking up the haiku stanza in his last book. He had a couple of poems in haiku stanzas before the last book, but the last book is is replete with them. So your smiling or the hope, the thought of it, perfectly regular, makes in my mind such pause and abrupt ease. You can't say, makes in my mind such pause and abrupt ease, right? You can't pronounce the word abrupt that way. It's accented normally in the second syllable, or always. So in that same line, you've got two metrical variations. This is in order not to tire the ear, right? That's why, and Wilbur would talk in terms like that, and he would talk in terms like that to our students over and over and over again. Make subtle variations so that the ear doesn't get bored and fall asleep. Makes in my mind such pause and abrupt ease, so two unstressed syllables followed by two stressed. So that fills out the five stressed line. It's the last time I'm going to say that. As when the highway bridge gates fall, balking, very nice, the fall, balking, carried over the line break, but with a comma, making that a slower move. The hasty traffic, which must sit on each side, massed and staring. This is a common enough scene. You've all experienced it, I'm sure. The drawbridge, the gates go down on the road, and then the drawbridge beyond the gates goes up, and a boat, a packet in this case, not a common word for a boat, but it's in Andrew Marvell and John Ashbery pretty famously. On one put drunk into the packet boat, right? Balking the hasty traffic, which must sit on each side, massed and staring, while deliberately the drawbridge starts to rise. One could do a number, and I'll only say it this time on alliteration. Students love to point out alliteration, especially on S, and Dick got tired of that in our classes, and so we stopped students doing it. You can hardly write a line or two, without repeating the sound of the letter S. But deliberately the drawbridge starts to rise, so the D's and the B's, deliberately the drawbridge starts to rise. These are minor felicities that add up and give you confidence in the poem. Then horns are hushed, another alliteration, of course. The oil smoke rarefies. Above the idling motors, one can tell the packet's smooth approach. The slip, and then this is beautiful, slip, comma, slip, slips, it slips over the end of the line to the beginning of the next. The word slip does. The silken river, slip, slip, silken river, past the sides. The ringing of clear bells, the dip and slow cascading of the paddle wheel. It is my observation here, I'm sure others have observed it, but I haven't seen it in print. Not that I've looked at every possible thing, but I think there's a nice recognition in this poem, quite subtly handled, that in love, desire has a strong component and should be honored and spoken of. So I won't be too explicit about this, but I'll read the lines that make one think in those, at least make me think in those terms. Deliberately the drawbridge starts to rise. The slip of the silken river past the sides, the ringing of clear bells, the dip and slow cascading of the paddle wheel. No comment beyond that. For C is a major love poem, as is the poem The House. A fair amount has been written about 4C, not much yet about the house, but certainly it will be. My grandson, when he was in high school in New York City, said, and I told him what I was doing with Dick Wilbur, and he said, "Oh, Dick Wilbur, can I come up and go to a class and then have lunch with Dick Wilbur?" Just the three of us, Dick and me and my grandson Jeff. So we went to Chez Albert, the almost late Chez Albert, which is closing, I'm sorry to say. Everybody should know that because it's a tragic event, at Chez Albert together. And my grandson Jeff asked Dick what his favorite poem was. All right, so when you're in junior high or sophomore in high school, it's the kind of question you ask. And he said, the last one, the one I've just written, called The House. And I think Dick believed that to the end of his life. He wrote it not that long before he died, of course. But here's for C, at least 10 years earlier, published in Mayflies 2000, as against Anterooms in 2010. It's a longer poem. It is stanzaic as well, but none of this fancy stuff about putting in two shorter lines in the same position in the stanzas. It's all iambic pentameter in a very, very straightforward rhyme scheme, A, B, B, A, C, C. The danger in that formulation or that stanza structure is that the couplet at the end, the CC rhyming lines, can seem detached, as to some extent, unless you work hard not to let them seem detached. Shakespeare's sonnets, after all, the great love poem sequence, in the language, I guess one would have to say, often go for 12 lines and then something at the end that comments on the 12 lines or contradicts what happens in the 12 lines. Dick doesn't do that. The couplet at the end of each of these 6-line stanzas is fully integrated into the stanza and doesn't stand apart or summarize. After the clash of elevator gates and the long sinking, there's again exactly what he did in the first poem that I just read. After and the long sinking and the long sinking. It's longer and sinking more for the 2 unstressed syllables and then the stress on long sinking. She emerges where a slight thing in the morning's crosstown glare. She looks up toward the window where he waits. Then, in a fleeting taxi, joins the rest of the huge traffic bound forever west. On such grand scale do lovers say goodbye, even this other pair whose high romance had only the duration of a glance, and who, now taking leave with stricken eye, see each in each a whole new life foregone. For them, above the darkling clubhouse lawn, bright Perseids flash and crumble, while for these who part now on the dock, weighed down by grief and baggage, yet with something like relief, it takes 3,000 miles of knitting seas to cancel out their crossing and unmake the amorous rough and tumble of their wake. We are denied, my love, their fine tristesse and bittersweet regrets, and cannot share the frequent vistas of their large despair, where love and all are swept to nothingness. Still, there's a certain scope in that long love which constant spirits are the keepers of, and which, though taken to be tame and staid, is a wild sostenuto of the heart, a passion joined to courtesy and art, which has the quality of something made, like a good fiddle, like the roses scent, like a rose window, or the firmament. It's one of the great poem conclusions in literature, I think I would want to say. So you have 3 couples that prove not to be constant lovers, articulated in the first 3 stanzas, in fact. Lots of felicities as one goes along. The first one, I mean, they've been together obviously for a while, I think. They look up towards each other, and the woman who's gone down the elevator gets in a taxi and goes forever west, which I take it means she's not coming back. On such grand scale do lovers say goodbye, even this other pair whose high romance had only the duration of a glance. That's perfect, isn't it? And that's pretty short duration, right? I glanced at her, she glanced at me. In my fantasy, we're attracted to each other. And who, now taking leave with stricken eye, see each in each a whole new life foregone. This is how to self-dramatize, right? One's life and one's love. For them, which Wilbur is definitely not going to do, and you know that by the end of the poem. For them, above the darkling clubhouse lawn, then this great line, bright Perseids. Listen to the meter there, bright Perseids. Perseids is always a 3-syllable word. Flash and crumble, so the meter crumbles a little bit, while this metaphor, Dick Wilbur is one of the great metaphor makers in poetry, for their affair, right? The Perseids flash a meteor shower and crumble like their putative relationship that lasted only as long as a glance. While for these who part now on the dock, so somebody's leaving on a ship to sail 3,000 miles, I would think, from America to Europe, but who knows, it's not specified. While for these who part now on the dock, weighed down by grief and baggage. That's a wonderful figure of speech. It's called a zeugma. Any of my former students who are here, and there are a couple, I think, probably got tired of my talking about zeugmas. Alexander Pope was the great master thereof. That is to say, a preposition followed by 2 nouns which are in such different categories as to make the conjunction witty. Grief is a serious matter, baggage is not. Made more telling by the fact that Wilbur breaks it over the line here, right? Weighed down by grief and baggage, which means it's not really much grief. Yet with something like relief, it takes 3,000 miles of knitting seas to cancel out their crossing. And unmake the amorous, there's another metrical shift, the amorous rough and tumble So the line becomes a little rough and tumbling of their wake. We are denied my love, direct address. We are denied my love, their fine tristesse. That's how they self-dramatize their losses, and bittersweet regrets, and cannot share the frequent vistas of their large despair, where love and all are swept to nothingness. Still, there's a certain scope in that long love. Now he speaks directly of his and his wife's love, which constant spirits, the others have not constant spirits, obviously, are the keepers of. Nice informal language, are the keepers of. And which, though taken to be tame and stayed by whoever takes them, mistakes them that way, is a wild sostenuto, a sustaining of each note, a wild sostenuto of the heart. You don't see the word sostenuto in poetry often or ever except here. A passion joined to courtesy and art, which has the quality of something made, like a good fiddle, like the roses scent, like a rose window, or the firmament. Those are truly inspired lines at the end. Not many poets could do it, and could have done it. This last stanza was spoken of, and you get details wonderfully presented in Bob and Mary's biography of Dick. Questioned by John Malcolm Brennan, who was a great friend of the two of them, and particularly of Charlie, the long correspondence that Bob and Mary quote often in their book to give texture to events that are unfolding in Dick's and Charlie's life. I think I want to use the singular there, although one has to use the plural as well. So Brennan questioned Dick about linking passion, courtesy, and art, claiming correctly that William Butler Yeats, in a poem called The People, had linked courtesy and passion, and saying that in Brennan's opinion, Yeats had trademarked that conjunction, and Wilbur refused to change the line, and thank heavens he refused to do it. And he also remarked on a good fiddle, which has the quality of something made, our relationship, our constant love. It's like a good fiddle, like something made, like a good fiddle. It's hard to make a good fiddle, right? The word fiddle is precisely chosen, and Brennan spoke about the slang sense of fiddle, which we don't think of very often because it's not that common in the language, but if you don't know what it is, it's sexual, look it up. Like the roses scent, the Urban Dictionary will tell you about that, .com. Like the roses scent, so a good fiddle is made by a human being. Like the roses scent, not made by a human being. We're not talking about breeding roses, blah, blah. Like a rose window, that's inspired. A rose is sent to a rose window, or magnificently, the firmament. So the creation, the creator's creation that Dick spent so much time celebrating magnificently in his poetry, makes an appearance at the end of this poem without more specification than the firmament. I'll take less time in the house. It's a shorter poem. It's absolutely straight up in terms of meter and rhyme. It's all in the past tense until it isn't, and it isn't only in one line, and that is the final line of the poem, and Bob and Mary have said it's one of the most haunting lines in all of modern poetry, and it is one of the most haunting lines of all in all of modern poetry, or maybe poetry. The house. Sometimes on waking, she would close her eyes for a last look at that white house she knew, in sleep alone and held no title to, and had not entered yet, for all her sighs. What did she tell me of that house of hers? White gatepost, terrace, fanlight of the door, a widow's walk above the bouldered shore, salt winds that ruffle the surrounding firs. Is she now there, wherever there may be? Only a foolish man would hope to find that haven fashioned by her dreaming mind. Night after night, my love, I put to sea. So third person for 11 lines, and first person, right? Spoken in the first person to a second person. Here identified as my love, as she was for Dick. So foolish as he is, puts, it's as it were, wanting to find her. Took me a long time to register the import of Widow's Walk. A Widow's Walk is a platform, and that, as most of you would know, maybe all of you know. Sorry to tell you if you already do, but it's a platform on the top of a house by the shore, by the Atlantic shore in New England, particularly in Maine, where wives would look for their husband's ships to return from their trade mission with Europe or whaling, and called a Widow's Walk because, of course, sometimes they didn't return. What I finally realized is that this poem is a widower's walk in language, in homage to a long love. So that's what I have to say. So at this point, we return to talking a bit about our friendships with Dick. Bill has volunteered to answer questions that any of us have raised in your minds about these poems or anything else relating to Dick Wilbur. You have the experts in front of you. But first, we'll let Bob and Mary talk about Dick, and then I'll say a few words, and then if you have any questions for Bill, and then we'll close with Ralph showing a few more minutes of footage. Bob and Mary.
Yeah. So this is going to be a dialogue between Mary and me. In the words of Margaret Bullitt Jonas, the Episcopal priest who officiated at Wilbur's memorial service in Cummington last November, what people treasured in Wilbur was not that he lived to a ripe old age, but that he lived with such creative verve, with such open-hearted generosity and vitality. Dick was not just full of years, he was full of life, full of spirit.
As Wilbur's biographer, we had a unique first-hand experience of that life and spirit. Bob came to know Dick at Amherst in 1957, as David mentioned earlier. And I met him in 1995 at a reading he gave at Simon's Rock College in Great Barrington. But our joint knowing of the man began more than 12 years ago when Charlie suggested that Bob write Dick's life. We've decided to share with you excerpts from a journal he kept during the late 1960s and 70s, something that he shared with us. It has never been published except for the excerpts in our book.
In the early days of researching our biography, we spent hours in the Wilbur home interviewing Dick and Charlie together and separately, each of us armed with a mini tape recorder.
On November 5th, 2005, after one such visit, Dick sent Bob a short letter.
Bob, dear Bob, he wrote, when I learned that you had found the briefly lost tape of your talk with Charlie, I was a little disappointed because I am known in our household as the Finder and had already done a Sherlock Holmesian examination of the driveway. I hope that you will mislay something else in the future and give me a chance to show my powers.
Having been the one to locate the missing tape in the crevices of Bob's briefcase, I was heartened to know that Dick and I shared a talent. Many passages in Dick's journal show his deep connection to the natural world, his capacity for self-effacing humor and wit, and his curiosity. Others reveal inklings of a thought or image that later became a poem. Some are obvious, like this one for the writer.
Her uneven typewriting in a nearby room sounds like a large bird with a broken wing, struggling in leaves and brush.
And this for the mind reader.
He hopes that God finds more encouragement in men's thoughts than he has.
Others are not so obvious, like this single line.
The exiles, refugees, insulted, their distinction unrecognized.
Dick wrote that a full decade before working with the composer William Schumann on the Statue of Liberty oratorio called On Freedom's Ground. Dick's journal contains a number of one-liners, ranging from word definitions to intellectual probings. For instance,
keys, they accumulate. We forget what half of them once opened.
This one I love. The young are not so much sensitive as they are touchy. Here's one more. It is the plain cooking that counts. That's a quote by Escoffier, Dick tells us, who invented 7,000 recipes.
In the following passage, Dick shows himself to be an astute judge of a certain kind of character.
The comedian is not himself, he wrote. There is somebody worse or more pitiful whom he pretends to be, and whom he loves, though it be a stingy man, Jack Benny, a fool, Ed Wynn, a hornswoggler, W.C. Fields and Groucho, a vulgarian, Durante, a dummy, Bergen McCarthy, or an imposter, Peter Sellers, with something like the mercy of God.
Here is a profound example of Dick's wordplay. Shall I resolve my doubts? I have too much faith for that. And another on our alertness to wordplay or lack thereof. If one were asked, what do you think of the Grand Canyon? And replied, it is abysmal. How many would get it?
The last entry we'll share shows Dick, an astute judge of himself, striving to be a good and happy man.
I have noticed that I am happiest when taken out of myself, either by the desire to say or write or do something better than my ordinary lumpish self could do it, or by going out to others in aid or sympathy. The poor ordinary self may take an anxious pleasure in achievement or service conducive to reputation and approval, but the true reckless self feels only wonder at the deed, which is so much better than the materials of which it is made. Our sadness is we often resist and fear happiness and only fitfully pursue it. And there is the difficulty, too, that the impulses toward achievement or generosity are so often practically at variance. Shall I help my sick neighbor by tending his Herefords, or shall I try to finish a poem in progress?
Thank you. I'll be really brief at this point. In Ralph's opening film segment, he films Dick speaking and saying that I had been his tennis partner for years, and that's true. We were tennis partners on the same side of the net against usually local attorneys, but not always, occasionally a clergyman. And I could talk at length about our tennis, but that would truly bore you. It was a lot of fun. There was a dip in the pool and a gin and tonic after, always. And it was wonderful, and that developed into a friendship of many, many years and decades that, of course, I treasure. The other was our teaching together, and we've got enough of that in Ralph's film. Dick very generous about me there. I don't want you to leave with the impression that there weren't difficulties in Dick's mostly charmed life, really charmed in that he married exactly the right person, and that the right person married him. I got to know Charlie pretty well over the years, and she was a great aid to me and to my wife, Lisa. She was a strong supporter of our union and spoke of it often and movingly. I came into their lives when their lives were not so easy. in point of fact. We're talking about the mid-1980s, when, after they came home from France, where they had, both of them, had been on a 6-month fellowship in the south of France, and was working on a translation of Phèdre there, and got it done, but it was cold. It's cold in south of France in January and February and March. I can tell you, I've lived there. And they got hooked on sleeping medications and antidepressants. Came back to America. The story is told with extreme tact but adequate thoroughness in Bob and Mary's book. I mean, I learned things that I did not know, despite my long friendship with them, from the book about this very period. And I never paid much attention to it, but looking back at the mid-1980s, I realized that I was playing tennis with Dick and Charlie at a time when things were not terribly easy. And I won't go into many details, but rather I'll let a poem of Dick's speak to that time. The poem is called At Moorditch. Moorditch is a ditch in east central London. And Dick Wilbur doesn't have notes to very many of his poems in the back of his individual volumes, but he did write a note on this poem, and it reads as follows. In Act 1, Scene 2 of Henry IV, Part 1, Shakespeare, of course, Prince Hal says to Falstaff, quote, "What sayest thou to a hare or the melancholy of Moorditch?" End quote. Dick Wilbur. Moorditch seemed to me a good name for the sort of hospital where people are treated for depression, as Dick and Charlie were, as Bob and Mary set out in 10 or 15 pages, and accurately and movingly. So this poem comes out of that experience. At Moorditch, now said the voice of lock and window bar, you must confront things as they truly are. Open your eyes at last and see the desolateness of reality. Things have, I said, a pallid, empty look, like pictures in an unused coloring book. Now that the scales have fallen from your eyes, said the sad hallways, you must recognize how childishly your former sight salted the world with glory and delight. This cannot be the world, I said, nor will it, till the heart's crayon spangle and fulfill it. I wouldn't have taken that poem, but I've read past it, a handful of times in the past, but reading Bob and Mary's biography made this poem connect with my actual life, my actual friendship with Dick and Charlie. Charlie spoke to me at some length about that hard time. It was just a couple of years. They got through it, and things were fine after that, as far as I know. But it's a proper tonic, I think, to speak at this point of the fact that although Dick's life was itself a celebration of love and of marriage and of the world, the created world, and Dick really believed it was made by a creator. So, there was nothing simple, and you know that by now, and you've known it before you came into this room, but nothing simple about Dick's affirmation of the made world, the created world. Ralph has some footage at the end, going to end our program, in which he has records Dick reading poems, a number of poems, handful of poems, 4 or 5, about the created world and the glory that it presents and the glory that Dick's rendering of that world presents to us, his readers. But before that, because that's going to be the end of the program, and then if anybody wants to see any more footage, Ralph has it. You can come up and request it, and he can show some more. But if you have questions, Professor Pritchard is your man. Greg. Got to speak up loudly.
I would like you to speak about haiku.
Haiku?
No, I don't deal with that.
That's the end?
Yeah, I
Okay.
don't. I don't deal with it. It's a Japanese form.
Are you an expert in haiku? No.
Here's a-
Well, I want to say a word about haiku. Would anybody else like to say a word about haiku? one word? I'll say 5. It's 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables, the end. Unrhymed. Japanese form, classic Japanese form, adapted into English, not by Dick first by any means. A lot of people have attempted haiku in English, haikus. But Dick, towards the end of his life, in order to escape what at that point might have seemed to him, I'm speaking in tentative language, he never quite said this to me, was the tyranny of the iambic measure, right, in English, haiku or not in meter. 5, 7, 5, not in meter, and not rhymed in Japanese poetry, I believe, but Dick adopted the stanza rhyming lines 1 and 3 and wrote poems with, half a dozen haiku in constituting an individual poem. So, Greg, I think the point of the answer is that Dick didn't consider himself anything like an expert in Japanese poetry, or I don't think he translated any haiku, but he found it a very convenient, I would go so far as to say liberating form for what he had to say. This whole thing started with Ecclesiastes 11:1, which is in haiku stanzas, and was happy to be doing it.
It's a bad form, though.
It's a bad form because many English poets, English language poets, have used it for bad poems.
Almost as bad as the sestina.
And see, we don't always agree, even though we teach together and are long time friends. There are a couple of good sestinas in the language, including one by, believe you me, Elizabeth Bishop. Yes. Bill.
About
Translations. This is Esther. Dick's translations of poems.
I can't. I'm sorry. I don't know enough to do that.
He loved doing it. He was really good at it. A lot of people in this room would have experienced, either on the page or on the stage, Dick's translations of Molière's principal comedies. They were often played, and some Racine tragedies, and finally a Corneille towards the end of his life. He translated, Bob and Mary know this every bit as well as I do, they probably know it better, but he translated with considerable help from native speakers of the, or scholars. In the case of the Dante, he was, I think, inspired by Professor Singleton of Harvard and Johns Hopkins. He did one of the cantos in a collection of cantos by many different English language translators. Sorry?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. So he loved translating, and it was to some extent, I think, a break from the burdens of writing lyric poetry, which is very hard to get right, for all the times he got it right. But the other thing that I would say about it is that most of the translations are from French. Dick knew French well. Charlie knew French better than Dick. Charlie was a very active participant in Dick's translating of French poetry and French drama. More you would want to say?
Yeah. This is how he began to translate Molière and from the French. He had a Guggenheim to work on a play, and they went to New Mexico to do it. And Dick began to write a play and showed the first draft of the first few pages to Charlie. And Charlie said, "Dick, this will never do. All of these voices sound like you. They're yours. In a drama, the voices have to play off each other, be in conflict. Conflict is the heart of drama." And so Dick mulled this over, and then he drove down to the library of the University of New Mexico, and he found a copy in French of Molière, and he brought that back, and thus began his stage career. Last?
And immediately, Charlie objected and said, that's not true. You can translate the poetry in a poem. And two or three other people around the table agreed that Dick had shown that it was true. With great care, you could translate it. I don't remember if Dick was there, but my memory is that he was, and he sort of nodded.
Thank you. Yeah.
I've been trying to understand Richard Wilbur's poetry for a long time now, and trying to place it in a cadre of possible perspective. I was an English major, English honors student here at Amherst, and benefited from a wonderful liberal arts education. It seemed to me, in terms of his voice, and I want to use the term heroic voice, or quiet voice, or poetic voice, or academic voice. When I think of Dylan Thomas and some of his lines, like, do not go gently into the good night, rage, rage at the passing of the light, it has an immediate poeticness to it, to me, and it has an immediate heroic or Olympian voice to it. It's a large voice. Whenever I read Richard Wilbur, I see a quiet voice, a modest voice, an academic voice, a voice that lived within privilege itself, which I think you've outlined interestingly here, the life of Kai Sai, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant reserve exclusive area of life. And from there he took his perspective. I'm not saying it with any pejorative sense, but a somewhat limited sense as compared to other poets in the pantheon of poets, which either Keats or Shelley or Dylan Thomas or Eliot, not the same size of voice. My comment's not meant as a criticism, but an effort to penetrate and understand this particular brilliant voice. And I wonder how you might characterize his voice as compared to some of the other voices of that time.
I want to quote a great English critic, Australian critic named Clive James, who spoke about Wilbur's impact to the post-war poets. And James says, on the aspiring pole, among his fellow Americans, he had the impact of a Rococo asteroid, burning up their air with his displays of cool fire. Anyone capable of appreciating his artistry was helpless not to emulate it, and emulation guaranteed mediocrity. Well, that's a good term. You know.
If I could, may I just comment very briefly? It seems that as compared to voices like Stephen Spender, I think continuously of those who are truly great, and these, quote, memorable poems. I'm sure these poems remain memorable to you as intellectuals within the academy, but I'm wondering how much the voice became a public voice, because I don't think I would have come across him if we hadn't had the Amherst College life in common.
I'm not sure he wanted to become a public voice. Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated question and not unjust. Nobody can do everything on the page. I would assert strongly and argue in detail, if necessary, that Dick Wilbur's a much better poet than Dylan Thomas, despite the obvious glory of the beginning of that poem, Do Not Go Gentle. But Dick would have thought that, although he appreciated Dylan Thomas, and Dick was the most generous of speakers about other poets. I mean, he could see the goodness in everybody, even poets who were very different from him, as Thomas indeed was. But it would have been too Vatic, too prophet-like for Dick, although Dick wrote a poem, Advice to a Prophet, but advice to a prophet, not speaking it's himself in the poem, in the voice and in the tone of prophecy. So, I mean, for my money, nobody, not even Milton, right, can do the whole range. The only person who can do the whole range is not Keats either, not Wordsworth, certainly not Eliot, for all of the glories of these great, great poets, but Shakespeare. And this is just a truism to speak it, and probably nobody here would disagree with it, but Shakespeare was able to do the whole thing, right? But that's partly a result of the fact that he wrote plays. He's writing comedies, writing tragedies, writing history, and you have to be a different. I mean, negative capability. That's what Keats said about Shakespeare. He was able to negativize, if you will, himself, and capable of creating the voices and totally credible voices that you could live within of other characters. Yeah.
David, I want to just add one thing to that.
Please.
Aside from Advice to a Prophet, there is one other very political poem that Dick wrote about Lyndon Johnson when Lyndon Johnson invaded a small country. And the phrase in the poem that stands out is, "the imposition of our cattle brand."
Texas.
Yeah.
When you, excuse me.
Yeah. Well, a public voice that's absorbed into the characters, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, there are many brilliant lyrics. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Lisa and I saw a production just, a year and a half ago. It keeps getting produced in different formats. The Santa Fe Opera is doing it this summer. God knows what format they'll use. I think Dick, when he and I talked about it once, and Bob and Mary, I'm sure talked with him about it too, kind of threw up his hands because Bernstein kept changing the music. Dick had to keep changing the lyrics and so on, and it didn't kind of. And the producer of the production in New York put limitations on it, as I understand. There's a lot of wonderful material on the whole Candide, frustrating experience, but the end product, especially if one looks at the particular lyrics that Dick composed, is really wonderful. Yeah.
To what extent do you hear, when you hear Wilbur, to what extent do you hear an ironic voice? And if you do, how important would you say irony in any aspect would be important in that voice to him?
The question is about irony?
Yes.
And what about it?
Do you hear irony? And if you do, how important do you think
Well,
irony?
those three poems I read, if there isn't irony there, I mean, irony doesn't do very well at this college anymore. Nobody
doesn't do very well in what?
Nobody who graduates ever gives a speech on irony, I've noticed.
Well, I'm asking because irony had a good reputation when I went here. So
They should read more Wilbur.
That can't be bettered, right? Yes.
You kept saying the word glance, and what we have in our hands reads dance. Maybe it's not a big distinction, but you made a point about how brief the glance was, but we have...
What line, I'm sorry, in 4C?
Second stanza and the third line.
Oh, glance. It's glance, right? It should be glance.
No, that's what I want. That's the
Oh, and I said glance.
Yeah. What is it?
It is glance. Glance is the right word.
It is glance. I mistyped it.
This lady here is quoting from the book. It says glance.
This is the aging prof typing out a poem. Late at night, as I often do
You have to
for
type out the
students.
poem out loud in order to get the...
My apologies to all of you and to Dick Wilbur. But dance works pretty hard.
Yeah.
Pretty well.
He probably.
Only the duration of the dance. A glance is, yeah. Maybe we should stop there. An embarrassment. Well, that's not the final. That's the stop of our talking. And then Ralph is going to show 10 minutes or so of film. So stay to watch that if you have the time. You don't have to go to another. Or choose not to go to another program. We will not not be disappointed. You will not be disappointed if you stay. Yeah. No, you're the right to do it. Absolutely. Thank you. Well, it could have been dance, but it's much briefer and therefore more melodramatic. Good to see you. Yes. Well, we want to show this footage. Okay, Joseph.
Well, while we're waiting for it to come up there, let me just say that a bit about me. Let me just say a bit about what it was like to know Dick Wilbur. I'll abbreviate what I was going to say because of time constraint. He told me that his good friend Robert Frost once described a poem as a momentary stay against confusion. And that was, for me, rather what it was like to sit in Dick's company. I don't think that I've ever felt so welcomed into one's home as I did with Dick, nor did I leave with such a feeling of invigoration and inspiration and hope that somehow things are going to turn out well in one's life. Is it ready to go?
What, the video?
Yeah, I've got it on the computer here.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, anyway.
Distress.
No, this should be showing up there.
Oh, okay.
It's not showing up. Well, while we're waiting for that, I don't think there's one thing I don't think we mentioned here, and that's the metaphysical aspect of his poem. In many parts of the film, particularly Dana Gioia talks about Dick's ability to look into these simple, almost commonplace things in the world, and particularly in nature, and through his genius and his contemplation of it, be able to transport us to another level, a sense of the eternal. I'm agnostic, but Dick Wilbur's poetry is about as close as I get to sensing that there is something that connects everything, as Thornton Wilder says in that play, that urging towards the eternal. Which reminds me, at the end of that play, well, there we are. At the end of that play, Emily says, do any human beings ever realize every moment of life, every minute? And the stage manager pauses and he says, no, and then he reconsiders and he says, well, the saints and poets maybe, they do some. And that's Dick Wilbur. Both. Anyway, he said in one of his poems, The Ceremony, right? We are the woods we wander in. So here we will look at three wanderings into Dick's woods behind his home in Cummington, where he does contemplate the eternal, or the force, or whatever you will have it, through specific instances of nature. If I can get this to come up. Are we getting any sound? No sound yet. It's coming. Okay. Well, I'll continue to talk. What Dick was particularly, you want to check that? Okay. Let me just back it up. The first is of Hamlin Brook, and all I'm showing you is Hamlin Brook. This was done at a time when Dick could no longer walk out into the woods, and I said, you want to give me directions on how to get to Hamlin Brook, which he was all too eager to do. When I came back, if you could only have seen the look on his face as he drank in the images of his beloved brook. So here is his brook and his poem together, or here they are together.
Hamlin Brook. At the alder darkened brink, where the stream slows to a lucid jet, I lean to the water, dinting its top with sweat, and see, before I can drink, a startled inchling trout of spotted near transparency, trawling a shadow solider than he. He swerves now, darting out to where, in a flicked slew of sparks and glittering silt, he weaves through streambed rocks, disturbings, foundered leaves, and butts then out of view beneath a sliding glass, crazed by the skimming of a brace of burnished dragonflies across its face, in which deep cloudlets pass, and a white precipice of mirrored birch trees plunges down toward where the azures of the zenith drown. How shall I drink all this? Joy's trick is to supply dry lips with what can cool and slake, leaving them dumbstruck also with an ache nothing can satisfy.
And the next should be mayflies.
Mayflies. In somber forest, when the sun was low, I saw from unseen pools a mist of flies in their quadrillions rise and animate a ragged patch of glow with sudden glittering, as when a crowd of stars appear through a brief gap in black and driven cloud, one arc of their great round dance showing clear. It was no muddled swarm I witnessed, for in entrechat each fluttering insect there rose 2 steep yards in air, then slowly floated down to climb once more, so that they all composed a manifold and figured scene, and seemed the weavers of some cloth of gold, or the fine pistons of some bright machine. Watching those lifelong dancers of the day as night closed in, I felt myself alone in a life too much my own, more mortal in my separateness than they. Unless I thought I had been called to be not fly or star, but one whose task is joyfully to see how fair the fiats of the caller are. In the woods behind our house in Cummington, Massachusetts, there is a great black birch, which is very ancient, as one tells at first glance. And a forester who once walked through my woods with me and looked at that black birch said it was so old that there's no doubt it was familiar in its early stages to the eyes of the Mohicans. A black birch in winter. You might not know this old tree by its bark, which once was striate, smooth, and glossy dark. So deep now are the rifts which separate its roughened surface into flake and plate. fancy might less remind you of a birch than of mosaic columns in a church like Araceli or the Lateran, or the trenched features of an aged man. Still, do not be too much persuaded by these knotty furrows and these tesserae to think of patterns made from outside in, or finished wisdom in a shriveled skin. Old trees are doomed to annual rebirth. New wood, new life, new compass, greater girth. And this is all their wisdom and their art, to grow, stretch, crack, and to not yet come apart.